Situational determinants of altruism. People don't always act on the basis of their empathic impulses. Consider the horrifying tragedy that befell Kitty Genovese on March 13, 1964, when Winston Moseley stalked her as she walked home in Queens, New York. He attacked her near her apartment and stabbed her in the back as she ran away. After her initial cries for help, lights went on and windows opened in the surrounding apartments. Moseley left, but returned wearing a hat to disguise his face, stalked his victim to a stairwell in her building, then stabbing her 8 more times and raping her. New York police got a call 30 minutes after the cries of distress first awakened neighbors. By the time they arrived, Kitty Genovese was beyond help and died in the arms of one neighbor. Newspaper reports of the Genovese incident shocked the American public. Like Milgram's studies of obedience to authority, see chapters 1, 5, and 9, the episode raises fundamental questions about human nature. How can so many people be that indifferent to the suffering of others? Accounts of Kitty Genovese's murder moved several social psychologists to attempt to understand the processes that inhibit empathic concern and altruistic action and make people reluctant to intervene during emergencies. Failing to intervene in an emergency, Kitty Genovese was a young woman who was stalked and killed outside her apartment in Queens, New York. The presence of other people. One important factor that influences whether people will stop to offer help to others in need is the presence of other people. Bystander intervention refers to helping someone when people are witness to an emergency. Studies find that people are less likely to help when other people are around. 1981, in part, the presence of other bystanders at emergencies reduces the likelihood of helping because of a diffusion of responsibility. Knowing that others have seen the situation, each bystander tends to assume the others will intervene, indeed, may be better positioned to intervene, and thus each person feels less responsibility to help out. Bystander intervention. Assistance given by a witness to someone in need. Diffusion of responsibility. A reduction in the sense of urgency to help someone in an emergency or dangerous situation, based on the assumption that others who are present will help. One of the best-known studies on the effect of other people's presence on altruistic behavior was inspired by the Genovese tragedy, 1968. College students sat in separate cubicles discussing the problems associated with living in an urban environment. They engaged in this conversation over an intercom system, which allowed only one participant to talk at a time. One of them, a Confederate, one of the authors of this book as it happens, described his difficulties in adjusting to urban life and mentioned he had problems with seizures from time to time, especially when under stress. Then, after everyone else had spoken, the Confederate took his second turn. As he did so, he became increasingly loud and incoherent. He choked and gasped. Before falling silent, he uttered the following words: "If someone could help me out, it would sure be good, because cause I've got one of the ear things coming on, and I could really use some help. So if somebody would give me a little help, could somebody help choking sounds. I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die, help, seizure, chokes, and quiet." In one condition, participants were led to believe that their discussion group consisted of only 2 people, the participant and the victim. In another condition, the conversation was among 3 people, the participant, the future victim, and another person. And in a final condition, the audience was the largest. The conversation involved 6 people, the participant, the victim, and 4 other people. The question, of course, was whether the other students would leave their cubicles to help the victim, who was presumably suffering from a potentially lethal epileptic seizure. The presence of others had a strong effect on helping rates. 85% of the participants who were in the 2-person condition, and hence the only witness to the victim's seizure, left their cubicles to help. In contrast, 62% of the participants who were in the 3-person condition and 31% of those in the 6-person condition attempted to help the victim. In a related vein, several types of studies have examined whether people are less likely to help someone out when other people are around or when they are alone. In these studies, a participant might witness a victim in danger or someone passed out in the subway or a theft occurring in a store. Across these kinds of studies, 75% of people helped when they were alone, compared with 53% who helped when they were in the presence of others. Diffused responsibility. People often fail to help someone in obvious need because they don't interpret the situation as an emergency or because they assume that others will help. So you can see someone has fallen in the floor of a parking lot and they're just sitting there. Victim characteristics. Needless to say, altruism isn't blind, nor is it indiscriminate. People are most likely to help when the harm to the victim is clear and the need is unambiguous. Gartner and DeVideo, 1977. Researchers have studied altruistic intervention when a person in need either screams or remains silent. Bystanders help victims who scream and make their needs known 75 to 100% of the time, but they help silent victims only 20 to 40% of the time. More enduring characteristics of the victim also influence rates of helping. Most notably, studies find that people are more likely to help others who are similar to them, including those from their own racial or ethnic group or a similar social class background. In a study by Joan Chiao and her colleagues, African Americans responded with greater empathy and more altruistic inclinations when viewing the suffering of African Americans as opposed to European Americans. Only the suffering of participants' own group members activated a brain region, the medial prefrontal cortex, that's involved in empathic response, 2010. In keeping with this theme, studies of charitable contributions find that the wealthy tend to systematically direct their acts of philanthropy to institutions and organizations that benefit largely people like themselves, such as private universities and colleges and arts organizations, rather than social service organizations that benefit the poor, 2017. Other species appear to respond altruistically to their own group as well. Several non-human primates will give up the opportunity to eat and partially starve themselves if their action will terminate a shock that is being administered to a member of their own species, something they won't do for members of other species, 2002. Cross-species helping. Altruism between different species occurs with surprising frequency. This Rhodesian ridgeback adopted a tiny piglet when it was rejected by its mother and went so far as to feed it with milk from her own body. Aww. So you can see a dog with a little piglet. Box 14.2. Focus on daily life. The likelihood of being helped. A typical bystander is less likely to help in an emergency situation if other bystanders are around. But what are the chances of someone receiving help from any of the bystanders? When there are more bystanders, there are more people who might help. Consider the seizure study described in this chapter. When participants thought they were alone, they helped 85% of the time. When they thought there was one other person who might help, they intervened 62% of the time. If there really had been 2 bystanders, each of them with a 62% chance of intervening, the victim would have received help 86% of the time, virtually identical to the rate of receiving help with 1 bystander. Probability of receiving help equals 1 minus 0.38 squared equals 0.86. When participants thought there were 4 other people who might offer assistance, they intervened 31% of the time. Again, had there really been 5 bystanders, each of them with a 31% chance of intervening, the victim would have received help 84% of the time. Probability of receiving help equals 1 minus 0.69 to the power of 5 equals 0.84. Does this mean that it doesn't matter whether there are many or few people around? Not so fast. These studies have also measured how quickly people come to the aid of someone in distress, and they have consistently found that single bystanders act more quickly, than the quickest person to react in a group of bystanders. And when somebody is in an emergency situation, a lack of speed can be deadly. Construal processes and altruism. What would go through your mind if you encountered a person slumped over in a hallway while on your way to a meeting, or if you witnessed someone passing out on the subway? What is it about hearing obvious cries of distress or being in the presence of others that influences our inclination to help? In other words, what are the construal processes that influence whether we help or not? In everyday life, many instances of distress are surprisingly ambiguous. A loud apparent dispute between a man and a woman overheard on the street might be careening toward violence and require intervention, but perhaps it's only a non-threatening lover's spat, or just two thespians acting out a dramatic scene from a play. Similarly, a group of adolescent boys could be pummeling a smaller boy, or perhaps they're just playfully wrestling. Helping in ambiguous situations. Given the ambiguity of many emergencies, the decision to help means that the potential helper first has to believe that assistance is actually needed based on clues from the victim's behavior. As discussed earlier, when people in need vocalize their distress with loud cries, they're much more likely to be helped because their need for assistance is not ambiguous. Similarly, people are more likely to provide assistance when they are vividly aware of the events that led to the victim's distress. 1976. In a study demonstrating this, participants saw a Confederate who was unconscious. In the more vivid condition, participants saw the Confederate faint and slowly regain consciousness. In the less vivid condition, the participants saw only the aftermath of the incident, a Confederate just regaining consciousness. Participants were much more likely to come to the individual's aid, 89% versus 13%, when they saw the entire drama unfold because they understood the full nature of the problem. It's now believed that one reason many people didn't come to Kitty Geneviese's defense is that few people saw the full unfolding of the attack. Instead, they caught only glimpses of the murder and thus likely didn't understand the degree of harm taking place. The surrounding social context also influences whether bystanders will think help is needed. A form of pluralistic ignorance occurs when people are unsure about what's happening and assume that nothing is wrong because no one else is responding or appears concerned. See Chapter 4. Staying calm and collected in public, especially during emergencies, is dictated by established social norms. It's embarrassing, after all, to be the one who loses composure when there's no actual danger. When everyone in a potentially dangerous situation behaves as if nothing is wrong, each person will tend to mistake the other's calm demeanor as a sign that there's no emergency. 1968. Pluralistic ignorance. If someone's in trouble, bystanders may do nothing if they aren't sure what is happening and don't see anyone else responding. Are these three men playfully roughhousing and dancing around, or is a fight taking place? So yeah, you can see they're kind of touching each other and moving around, but what they're doing is not very clear. In one study that examined the role of pluralistic ignorance in bystander intervention, researchers asked participants to fill out a stack of questionnaires. 1968. Participants were assigned to one of three conditions in which they carried out this task: alone, in a room with two passive Confederates exhibiting the calm demeanor intended to produce pluralistic ignorance, or with two other genuine participants. As participants in these three conditions completed their questionnaires, smoke started to filter in from beneath a door, filling the room. When participants were alone and had no input from other participants as to what was happening, 75% of them left the room and reported the smoke to the experimenter. What could the other 25% have been thinking? In both of the two other conditions, pluralistic ignorance took hold, and participants were less likely to assume that something was amiss. Even in the condition with two other real participants, only 38% of the participants left to report the smoke. And remarkably, with two passive Confederates showing no signs of concern, only 10% reported the smoke to the experimenter. Anecdotal evidence from this study suggests that participants construed the smoke differently in the three conditions. The students who did report the smoke construed it as a sign of imminent danger. Participants who didn't report the smoke consistently reported that they didn't believe it was dangerous. One participant ventured the hypothesis that it was truth gas. Combating pluralistic ignorance. Bystanders are less likely to fall prey to pluralistic ignorance when they can clearly see one another's initial expressions of concern, and before these initial expressions are covered up out of the desire to seem less alarmed. In one study that illustrates this idea, participants had to pass by a worker doing repairs in a hallway on the way to the lab room where the study was being held, 1973. Once in the lab room, as part of the experiment, participants had to draw a picture of a horse, either by themselves, the control condition, facing another participant, or turned away from the other participant. As the participants labored over their drawings, they suddenly heard a loud crash, and the workman crying out in obvious pain, "Oh, my leg!" An impressive 90% of those who were alone, in the control condition, left the room to help the workman. The results of the other two conditions make it clear that seeing others' spontaneous emotional expressions reduces the effects of pluralistic ignorance. While only 20% of the participants who were seated back to back left to help the workmen, demonstrating pluralistic ignorance, a full 80% of those who were seated face to face left to help. Having others' initial unguarded reactions to help interpret the incident as a true emergency enabled these participants to overcome pluralistic ignorance and construe the situation as an emergency requiring their help. So how do you improve the chances of getting help when you need it? According to Darley, who studied the factors affecting bystander intervention for more than a decade, 2 things are likely to be effective. 1. Make your need clear. I've twisted my ankle and I can't walk. I need help. And 2. Select a specific person. You there, can you help me? By doing so, you overcome the 2 greatest obstacles to intervention. You prevent people from concluding there is no real emergency, thereby eliminating the effect of pluralistic ignorance, like there's no ambiguity, and you prevent them from thinking someone else will help, thereby overcoming diffusion of responsibility. Culture and altruism. Suppose it's late at night and you need assistance. Where do you think you'd be more likely to get help? In a large metropolis or a small rural town? In a poor neighborhood or a rich one? Near a church or far away from a place of worship? Each of these questions involves the influence of different kinds of culture, geographical region, social class, and religiousness on altruism. The prevalence of altruistic behavior varies in dramatic and sometimes surprising ways with these types of cultural influences. Altruism in urban and rural settings. All across the world, people are moving out of small villages in the country to large cities, and recent studies suggest that the communities they're leaving behind might be kinder and more altruistic. Survey research indicates that people in rural areas report higher levels of empathic concern, 2009. To investigate whether higher levels of empathic concern led to more altruistic behavior, Nancy Steble, 1987, reviewed 35 studies that focused on comparisons of helping rates in rural and urban environments. She looked at the helping rates in communities of different sizes, ranging from fewer than 1,000 people to more than 1 million. In all, 17 opportunities to offer assistance were created experimentally, typically in naturalistic settings. Researchers examined whether people would grant simple requests, such as giving the time of day when asked, whether they would intervene to stop a crime, and whether they would help people in need, an injured pedestrian, for instance. Steble's analysis showed that strangers are significantly more likely to be helped in rural communities than in urban areas, figure 14.2. The effective population size was particularly pronounced in towns with populations between 1,000 and 50,000. Thus, you're much more likely to be helped in a town of 1,000 than a town of 5,000, in a town of 5,000 then a town of 10,000, and so on. Once the population rises above 50,000, however, there's little effect of increasing population. Let's examine this finding a bit. You might ask which matters most for whether a person is likely to offer help, the person's current context, or the context in which the person was brought up. For example, if you were brought up in a small rural town, but currently live in a big city, which setting is more likely to influence whether you will help someone in need? As it turns out, the current situation wins, hands down. In analyzing the 35 studies, Steble found that the participants' current context, rural or urban, was a much stronger predictor of helping behavior than the person's rural or urban background. 1987. This finding is another nod to the power of the current situation. What accounts for this rural-urban difference in helping rates? Researchers have offered 4 explanations. Milgram, 1970, attributed it to stimulus overload. The amount of stimulation in modern urban environments is so great that no one can register all of it. As you walk down a city street, for example, the traffic, the construction, the swarms of people are, in combination, too much to take in fully. You narrow your focus in terms of attention and what circumstances you recognize as having a claim to your thoughts, feelings, and actions. There are simply too many inputs, so you shut down a bit and are less likely to attend to the needs of others, and thus likely to act altruistically. A second explanation might be labeled the diversity hypothesis. Earlier we noted that people are more likely to help others who are similar to themselves. Urban areas, of course, are made up of more diverse populations. Thus, on average, you're more likely to encounter someone similar to yourself in a rural environment than in an urban environment. This factor may also contribute to the observed urban-rural difference in helping rates. A third explanation is that more people are generally around to help in urban areas than in more rural environments, so a diffusion of responsibility could discourage people from helping out in urban settings. Finally, it's probable that in rural settings, people's actions are more likely to be observed by people who know them and who can comment on their reputation to others. Later, we'll learn how powerful reputational concerns are as triggers of pro-social behavior. Figure 14.2. Altruism in rural and urban environments. People in rural communities are more involved in helping others than people in urban settings. So this is a side-by-side bar graph. There are 5 categories on the x-axis, which are correct overpayment, help injured pedestrian, help lost child, tell your name, and give donation. And on the y-axis is the percentage of participants who respond from 0 to 90%. And the 2 sets of bars are urban and rural. So you can see people are more likely to engage in a variety of helpful acts in rural as opposed to urban settings. Yeah, so for each of these bars, rural is higher. So all the way across the board. Helping in the country. People living in rural settings, A, are more likely to help others than are people in the city, B, as shown here in different responses to people in need. So in A, you can see a guy giving assistance in a rural area, and B, you can see people walking past homeless people in the city not responsive. Again, I say to you, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Matthew 19:25. Social class and altruism. In June 2010, Bill Gates of Microsoft and investment guru Warren Buffett launched the Giving Pledge, a campaign to encourage the wealthiest people in the world to make a commitment to donate most of their wealth to philanthropic causes. They asked that the richest people in the United States give at least half of their wealth to charity. Buffett, a billionaire, pledged to give away 99% of his fortune by the end of his life. More than 170 of America's richest individuals soon followed suit, including Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, pediatrician Priscilla Chan, who pledged $45 billion to fight disease. Wealth and charity. Nicki Minaj has an extensive engagement with her philanthropy and has helped pay students' debts and given money to a village in India. How does social class influence levels of altruism? Are the Gateses and Buffetts of the world the rule, or the exception to the rule? When it comes to altruism, it turns out that those who have less give more, at least in terms of the proportion of their income that they donate to charity. Nationwide surveys of charitable giving in the United States find that wealthy individuals give away smaller proportions of their income to charity than people who are less well off. 2009, for example, a study by the organization Independent Sector, 2002, found that people making less than $25,000 per year gave away an average of 4.2% of their income, whereas those making over $100,000 per year donated only 2.7%. It would seem, then, that people like Gates and Buffett are exceptions. What investigators have learned about empathic concern and altruism sheds light on why the poor may give more than the rich. Specifically, Michael Krauss, Paul Piff, and their colleagues reason that a relative scarcity of resources leads lower-class individuals to be more empathically attuned to others, and they build strong relationships to help them to adapt to their more unpredictable, taxing, and sometimes threatening environments. Upper-class people, by contrast, enjoy more abundant resources and opportunities that enable them to be more independent, but less empathically in tune with others. In keeping with this theorizing, lower-class people prove to be more empathic than upper-class people in a variety of ways. They're better judges of the emotions of a stranger with whom they've just interacted. They're better judges of a friend's emotions. They're more accurate in their inferences about the emotions revealed in photographs. And they respond with greater empathic concern and compassion-related physiology to the suffering of others. Given these social class differences in empathy, are lower-class people more likely to act in a pro-social fashion? Piff and his colleagues have found that they are indeed more altruistic. 2010. In one study, for example, people from different class backgrounds played the dictator game, an economic game in which they received 10 points and were asked to give some portion of those points to a stranger. The number of points the participants had at the end of the experiment determined their chances in a lottery conducted after all participants had completed the study. On average, participants gave away 41% of their points, and lower-class participants gave away more of their points to the stranger than did members of the upper class. Subsequent research has found that in contexts in which economic inequality is high, the wealthy share even less. 2015, or they choose to share mainly with other wealthy individuals, only augmenting levels of economic inequality. What, then, might counteract these tendencies? One clear answer is to trigger empathic concern in well-off people. In one study guided by this idea, participants were given the chance to help an obviously distressed Confederate who had arrived late for the experiment and therefore needed the participants' assistance to complete required tasks. 2010. Before this opportunity to provide help, participants watched either a neutral film clip, a relatively uninteresting scene from the movie All the President's Men, or a moving portrayal of the suffering of children living in poverty. Showing the film about poor children was intended to induce upper-class participants to feel the same level of empathic concern typical of lower-class participants, which the investigators predicted would lead them to help out at higher rates than they otherwise would have. The findings supported these predictions, as shown in Figure 14.3. After watching a neutral film clip, lower-class participants offered to spend more time helping with the other participants' tasks than upper-class participants did. When upper-class people were made to feel compassion, however, they responded in the same pro-social fashion as their lower-class counterparts. Figure 14.3, Social Class and Altruism. This study demonstrated that lower-class people help more than upper-class people, except when both groups are made to feel compassion. Okay, so it's like a scatter plot, except the x-axis is a categorical variable and the y-axis is a numerical variable. So in the x-axis, the two categories are low social class and high social class, and on the y-axis are minutes spent helping from 6 to 13 minutes. Okay, and then the two categories, this is a dot plot, okay, I think, and the two categories of dots are neutral and compassion. So when you have a lower social class, the neutral and compassion minutes spent helping are the same, and when you have a high social class, when you watch the neutral video, you help the participant for about 9.5 minutes, but when you watch the compassionate video first to prime you, you help the new participant for about 12.5 minutes. So when the high social class people are primed, they are about as compassionate as the lower class people already were. Regardless of whether they were primed by compassion or not, they were already this compassionate.